And you agree, do you, Dr. Baxter, that you are the author of that letter which was published in the Fulchester Gazette and which attacked the safety policy of Fulchester Plastics?
Yes, I wrote it.
Would you read the letter to the court, please, Dr. Baxter?
Dear Sir, in last week's paper you carried a full-page advertisement on the subject of vinyl chloride used in the manufacture of PVC at Fulchester Plastics Incorporated. In this advertisement, Mr. Brian Jones, present manager of the plant, stated that there was no danger to health from vinyl chloride now that the new safe levels had been introduced. Since I have been in practice in Fulchester, several of his employees, who were also patients of mine, have fallen ill, and in 1971 one of them died from cancer of the liver and lung. New so-called safe levels may have been introduced after vinyl chloride became widely known as a cancer danger in 1974. But there is ultimately no safe level of exposure to a chemical known to cause cancer.
Dr. Barbara Baxter is the defendant in a libel action brought by Fulchester Plastics. Following a newspaper advertisement published by Fulchester Plastics describing new health and safety measures now in operation at the plant, Dr. Baxter wrote a critical letter which was printed in the local newspaper. The company alleged that her letter is defamatory. She does not deny this. Her defence is simply that everything she wrote was true and justified. The jury in this trial has been selected from members of the public whose names appear on the electoral register and who are eligible for jury service.
Their current advertisement must be viewed in the light of similar assurances in the past. It is nothing new for Fulchester Plastics to claim that levels are safe. They have made the same sort of claim many times over the past years. It is misleading and grossly irresponsible for them to claim that their new levels of vinyl chloride are safe. And in the light of their past record, it is difficult to accept that the advertisement was published in good faith and not out of an overriding concern to allay fear and keep open the Fulchester plant. Yours faithfully, Barbara Baxter, Doctor of Medicine, Bachelor of Surgery.
Thank you. Dr. Baxter, when you first started general practice in Fulchester, did you take a special interest in the manufacture of PVC right away?
Well, no, not really. I was interested in the plant in a general way, but no more so than in any other factory in the area. I have always been interested in occupational health, in illnesses connected with work.
Why was that?
I grew up in a mining village. My father was the local doctor there. As a child, I saw a lot of men suffering and dying from the effects of breathing in coal dust over a period of many years. It's the same with asbestos dust and vinyl chloride and many other of those chemical...
Dr. Baxter, are you saying that vinyl chloride is some sort of dust as well?
No, my lord. Vinyl chloride is a liquid gas used in the manufacture of PVC.
I see. A liquid gas, but people don't breathe it in, do they?
Yes, my lord. Vinyl chloride becomes a gas on contact with air, then you breathe it in.
Oh, and what happens when people breathe it in? What symptoms does it produce?
Well, in very high concentrations, it produces giddiness. It was once considered for an anesthetic. But in lower concentrations, it causes a range of illnesses. The one that's received the most publicity is, of course, cancer. Vinyl chloride has been linked to a very rare cancer of the liver, hemangiosarcoma. Then there's another disease known as acro-osteolysis, which is a disease of the bones, usually found in the hands of workers who clean out the drums in which the PVC is made. Then there are a whole lot of symptoms: tiredness, stiffness, shortage of breath, thickening of the skin, which seems to be related to acro-osteolysis.
Thank you, Dr. Baxter. Please continue, Mr. Lee.
Thank you, my lord. Dr. Baxter, when did you first start to think that there might be a connection between the PVC plant and disease?
Well, it wasn't really until I went to Russia in 1961. I was one of a medical delegation in that year. And while I was there, I heard about a study which had been made in 1949 and which found a link between vinyl chloride and liver abnormalities. I knew that as a result, the Russians set the levels of vinyl chloride to which workers might be exposed very low.
Did you do anything about this information?
Indeed, on my return, I made a point of looking up the summary of the article in Chemical Abstracts for 1950.
And did this confirm what you'd been told in Russia?
Yes, it did.
So, did you do anything with this information?
Well, I wrote to Mr. Jones' predecessor asking him if he was aware of the findings.
And did you receive any reply to this letter?
As far as I can remember, I received a card saying that my letter was receiving attention.
And did you hear anything further on the subject?
No.
Do you have this card, Dr. Baxter?
Oh, no, I'm afraid not, my lord. It was rather a long time ago.
I see.
Dr. Baxter, after you were alerted to the dangers of vinyl chloride by reading the abstract of this Russian study, did there come a time when you noticed symptoms in patients of your own who worked for the plaintiffs?
Oh, yes, but it wasn't for quite a while. Because of what the Russian study had said, I was looking specifically for liver disease, you see. Now, the first case that I picked up was that of a patient of mine, Thomas Chapman, who worked at the PVC plant.
And how long ago was this?
Oh, this was in 1967. That's to say, it was in 1967 that I reached a diagnosis. Mr. Chapman had been complaining of symptoms for a long while before that.
Could you explain what enabled you to reach your diagnosis?
Yes, I mean, it wasn't any great insight or clairvoyance on my part. I happened to notice an article in the British Medical Journal. It was written by two medical researchers employed by ICI, who also manufacture PVC. And it was about two workers who were suffering from acro-osteolysis, which is the bone disease I mentioned earlier. Yes. I remember thinking, as soon as I read it, oh, that's what it is. And then I was absolutely certain about Mr. Chapman, even though he wasn't manifesting clinical signs anything like as strong as those described in the article.
The article begins on page 5 of the agreed bundle of documents, my lord.
Yes, I have it here. Will you be calling Mr. Chapman as a witness, Mr. Lee?
Yes, my lord.
This article shows a somewhat disturbing picture of deformed hands. Are Mr. Chapman's hands deformed in this manner, Dr. Baxter?
No, my lord.
And yet you say that he suffered from this bone disease, acro-osteolysis, is that it?
If you will read the article as well as looking at the pictures, my lord, you'll see that it does refer to other symptoms apart from deformed hands.
Yes, I am perfectly able to read, Dr. Baxter. Trouble is that this article describes a large number of symptoms. Will you tell us precisely which ones Mr. Chapman suffered from when he consulted you?
Well, I did make precise notes at the time. May I refer to them, my lord?
Yes, by all means.
Now, the first notes are from March 1966. He was complaining of coldness in his hands and shoulders and a loss of power in his hands. He was also complaining of feeling tired and lethargic.
On examination, doctor, were you able to observe any other signs or symptoms?
Well, not at the time, but he came to see me again in May of that year, and on that occasion I saw his hands turn from white to purple to pink within a matter of seconds. He also complained of a tingling discomfort as this was happening. Now, I sent him to the hospital for blood tests, but nothing showed up. And then in December of that year...
This is still 1966.
That's right. In December 66, his condition was worse, and I could see a thickening of the skin on the wrists and hands. He couldn't flex his wrists properly. I sent him to hospital again for tests, this time with rheumatoid arthritis specifically in mind, but again we drew a blank.
So, how long after this was it that you were able to reach your diagnosis?
Oh, in 1967, when I read the BMJ article.
So, if your diagnosis is correct, it shows that prior to this time, 1967, the levels of vinyl chloride at Fulchester Plastics were dangerously high.
Precisely.
Did you inform the plaintiffs of your suspicions concerning Mr. Chapman, Dr. Baxter?
Yes, I did. I wrote to Mr. Jones enclosing a copy of the BMJ article on the subject of the ICI research.
With what result?
With absolutely no result at all. Mr. Jones did not reply.
When you received no reply from the plaintiffs, Dr. Baxter, did you take any further action?
Indeed I did. I went to see Mr. Jones.
This was in 1967.
Yes, it was.
And what transpired on that occasion?
Well, I asked him what he thought of the article. He said he hadn't read it.
Ah, but he did admit that he had received it.
Well, he didn't say that he hadn't. I assumed that he had. I'd sent it to him.
Now, did you inform him about Mr. Chapman?
Naturally I did.
And what was his reaction?
He said the plant had been operating for a number of years without anything like this happening. He accused me of looking for trouble, of putting ideas into patients' heads.
And after you'd been to see Mr. Chapman, after you'd been to see Mr. Jones about Mr. Chapman, when was the next time that you had dealings with Mr. Jones?
In December 1967, when Mr. Chapman was sacked.
Mr. Chapman was sacked. I see. What was the reason for this?
Well, the official explanation was that he'd been off work for too long.
I see. Thank you. Dr. Baxter, would you tell the court about the other patient whom you suspected of having a disease caused by vinyl chloride?
Oh, yes, Mr. Flynn.
Yes.
Now, Mr. Flynn was also a patient of mine. He died in 1971 of cancer of the lung. But there was also evidence of liver abnormality which had puzzled the hospital. They wanted to do a post-mortem, but Mrs. Flynn refused permission, and Mr. Flynn's body was cremated.
Now, did you inform Mr. Jones of your suspicions concerning Mr. Flynn?
Yes, I did. I wrote to him on October the 23rd, 1970. The court has copies of this letter,
Yes.
outlining Mr. Flynn's case and referring him to the 1949 Russian study. Again, I received no reply.
Did you take any further action?
Not at the time, but when vinyl chloride was implicated in cases of liver cancer in 1974, I suggested to Mrs. Flynn that she approach the company and that she also get in touch with her husband's union. When she had no joy, I went along to see Mr. Jones again myself.
Now, what was the date of this visit?
Oh, this must have been July 1974, the end of July.
Now, you went to see Mr. Jones with what in mind exactly?
I thought it possible that the company might agree to compensate Mrs. Flynn.
And you put this to Mr.
Oh,
Jones?
yes.
And what was his reaction to your suggestion?
He began shouting at me.
Shouting.
Yes, Mr. Jones is the proud owner of a very healthy pair of lungs.
Dr. Baxter, just tell the court the words that Mr. Jones used in his reply to your suggestion, please.
That there was no question of compensation, that his plant had always conformed to the accepted standards of safety, nobody could accuse him of negligence, no deaths had ever been caused at his plant by exposure to vinyl chloride. Then he rang for a security guard, shouting, "Throw her off the premises."
Did you leave at this point?
Yes, there was very little else I could do.
Have you seen Mr. Jones since then?
Not until today.
Now, in their recent advertisement, the one which prompted your letter to the Fulchester Gazette, Fulchester Plastics claim that they have reduced the level of vinyl chloride to which their workers are exposed even further than before.
Yes.
And they claim that this new level is safe and that it poses no danger whatever to human health.
Yes.
Now, in your letter to the press that has led to this libel action, Doctor, you claim that this advertisement of theirs is misleading and irresponsible. Now, would you explain to the court why you say that?
Yes. Most cancers take between 15 to 20 years to develop. We are only now seeing the effects of high exposures of 20 years ago. It will be another 20 years before we know absolutely whether the present levels cause cancer. It is very misleading to tell people that the latest accepted standard is safe. Nobody knows. That's the truth of the matter.
Dr. Baxter, you spoke of a visit to the Soviet Union, didn't you?
Yes.
You admire the way things are organized there, I take it?
I admire the way some things are organized, yes.
I believe you stood for Parliament in 1970, Dr. Baxter.
Yes, I did.
Would you please tell this court for which party you stood?
Really, my lord, Dr. Baxter's political beliefs can have no possible bearing on the results of this case.
My lord, my clients contend that Dr. Baxter's harassment of them stems from her political motivations. Her political opinions, therefore, are central to this case.
Yes, you may proceed, Miss Dunwoody.
As your lordship pleases.
Dr. Baxter, for which party did you stand in 1970?
I stood as candidate for the Communist Party.
You favour the communist system.
I'm a communist. It's hardly likely I wouldn't favour a communist system.
So, of course, as a communist, I suppose you would be prepared to engage in subversive activities to bring down the capitalist system.
Oh, yes, Red's under the bed. You must be quite aware that the Communist Party in this country has for some years now believed in change by parliamentary process, hence my standing as a candidate for the Communist Party in the 1970 general election.
But you would describe yourself as an anti-capitalist.
Certainly I am.
Dr. Baxter, it has been your intent all along, has it not, in your dealings with Fulchester Plastics to discredit this company and through unfavourable publicity to force them to close down production, knowing full well the repercussions this would have on other industries and on the economy of the country.
You're talking rubbish.
But I'm right, am I not, in thinking that the end of all PVC production is what you would like to see?
What I would like to see is the production of PVC made safe for human beings.
But if it cannot be made 100% safe?
In that case, I think that people are more important than plastic.
Now, you claim to have known about a study done in Russia in 1949. You read Russian, do you, Dr. Baxter?
No, I do not. What I said was that I was told about a study when I visited Russia in 1961.
And so you came back to this country, and with a conscientiousness quite outstanding among busy family doctors, you took the trouble to trace the abstract of this article.
I happened to live on the doorstep of a PVC plant. I dare say if I hadn't, I wouldn't have bothered.
Did you send a copy of this abstract to Mr. Jones's predecessor?
No, I didn't. Photocopying wasn't nearly so widespread in those days as it is now. I summarized the contents.
Yet there's no record of this letter on the company's files.
I can hardly be held responsible for that.
And you cannot find the acknowledging card you claim to have received from them.
I did receive it.
We have only your word for that. You see, the point I'm getting at, Dr. Baxter, is that it's very easy now, with all that's been written about PVC and vinyl chloride, to lay claim to an earlier knowledge of the subject. What I find that is not credible, Dr. Baxter, is that in 1961, you should have been unique in this country in knowing of an obscure Russian study done in 1949.
But that's precisely my point. I should not have been unique. It was the responsibility of management to make sure that they read world literature on the subject, or at least that they employed doctors to do so.
Dr. Baxter, what I'm suggesting that is surprising is not that management did not know of this obscure Russian study, but that you did. I find that very unlikely.
Well, I did know of it.
You see, following from that, I'd like to ask you about Mr. Flynn. Now, Mr. Flynn died in 1971, I think you said?
Yes, that's right.
And you also said that you, or the hospital, thought there was some abnormality in his liver.
Yes, the hospital thought there was a cancer there.
Now, you also said that the reason you did not pick up, as you put it, Mr. Chapman's symptoms initially was that you were on the lookout for liver disease.
Yes.
So, if we are to believe that you had been on the lookout for liver disease all along, since 1961, that is, when you claim to have read this Russian study...
I read the abstract.
When you read the abstract of this Russian study, surely it would have been a matter of crucial importance to you to establish whether or not Mr. Flynn died from a cancer of the liver that might have been attributable to vinyl chloride.
That's precisely why I wished there'd been a post-mortem, and why the hospital specialist wanted one.
Yet this post-mortem never took place.
As I said earlier, Mrs. Flynn did not wish it to take place.
Dr. Baxter, I suggest that the reason you did not insist on the post-mortem was that you were not on the lookout for liver disease at all, and that if you had read this study, as you say you had, you would have insisted, because it might have provided very important evidence indeed to support that paper.
That's not true.
I also suggest it would never have occurred to you to link Mr. Flynn's death with vinyl chloride, had there not been all the publicity about it 3 years later in 1974. And further, that neither you nor anyone else in this country was aware of this particular danger from vinyl chloride before then. Not through negligence or malice, but because, as you yourself have stated, it is an unfortunate fact that we cannot know what chemical substances do to human beings until the human beings have been exposed to them for some considerable time.
I would say that animal experiments provide reasonable indication.
Yes. Well, one final question, Dr. Baxter. With regard to your letter to the Fulchester Gazette, in which you allege that it is grossly irresponsible of my clients, Fulchester Plastics, to claim that their present levels of vinyl chloride are safe. Are you aware that the levels at the plant are now well within the code of practice laid down by the Health and Safety Executive?
That is not the point.
You still maintain that these levels are unsafe?
It is irresponsible to guarantee that they are safe.
So you are saying that you an ordinary family doctor, know more about what is or what is not safe than do all the experts of the CBI, the TUC, and the Health and Safety Executive.
What was the date of your husband's death, Mrs. Flynn?
He died in 1971, May 18th, 1971.
And how long was he ill before he died?
Well, a couple of years, really. I mean, he'd been going downhill for some time before he went into hospital, and he was in hospital for 6 months before he died.
Could you explain to the court what you mean by going downhill?
Well, the first thing I noticed was the way he lost weight, and then all his clothes seemed to look too big on him.
Can you say what year this weight loss started?
Yes, it would be about the end of 1968, beginning of 1969, sometime around then.
And was your husband complaining of any other symptoms about this time?
Well, he had this pain from time to time in his stomach, about here.
Did he go to the doctor about this?
No, he wouldn't go. He wasn't one to bother a doctor unnecessarily.
So, when was the first time your husband actually saw Dr. Baxter?
Well, in the October of 1970, he took this pneumonia. He'd had a bad cough for quite a long time, and then he went down with pneumonia, so we called Dr. Baxter in then, and that's when he went into hospital for the first time.
Mrs. Flynn, did you, at any stage in your husband's illness, mention his stomach pains to Dr. Baxter?
No, I didn't. Not until she told me that the hospital thought that there might be something wrong with his liver.
And when was this?
This was after he went into hospital for the last time. He went in January 1971. And what happened, one day I went in to visit him, and he told me that they'd had a liver specialist in to see him, and they were going to do some tests. Well, of course, hospitals don't tell you very much, so I rang Dr. Baxter up about it.
And what did she have to say?
And she said yes, they were puzzled. And then she went on to ask me how long he'd worked at the PVC plant and what departments he'd been in and that.
Did she say why she was asking you this?
Yes, she said that some people believed that you did get the disease from working with PVC, yes.
Now, Mrs. Flynn, after your husband's death, the hospital asked you if they could do a post-mortem, didn't they?
Yes.
And what was your attitude to this?
Oh, I didn't like the idea. Well, you see, he'd suffered such a lot before he died. I didn't want any more messing about with him.
So, you refused permission?
Yes.
Did Dr. Baxter speak to you on the subject of a post-mortem?
No, not Dr. Baxter. It was all between me and Dr. Gill.
The liver
Yes,
specialist?
yes.
Was the subject of the post-mortem ever mentioned to you afterwards by Dr. Baxter, Mrs. Flynn?
Not until 1974. Dr. Baxter said she thought it would be worth my while writing to the company and that I might get some compensation. She said that she thought we would have enough evidence even without the post-mortem.
And did you write to the company?
Yes.
And what happened?
I got a letter back saying that unless I could prove that my husband had died of cancer of the liver caused by vinyl chloride, there was nothing they could do.
Which, of course, you could not do.
No, not with him being cremated, you see.
The cases in Fulchester Crown Court are fictitious. Join us again tomorrow when the case of Fulchester Plastics against Dr. Barbara Baxter will be resumed in the Crown Court. Barbara Baxter, a Fulchester doctor, is being sued for libel by Fulchester Plastics because of a letter she wrote to the local paper claiming that for many years the company had ignored her warnings that vinyl chloride, used in the manufacture of PVC, is a danger to health. Yesterday, Mrs. Flynn, the widow of a patient of Dr. Baxter's, testified that Dr. Baxter told her in 1971, 3 years before the dangers of vinyl chloride were widely recognized, that her husband's illness might be related to his work. The jury in the trial has been selected from members of the public whose names appeared on the electoral register and who are eligible for jury service. Today, Mrs. Flynn returns to the witness box to be cross-examined by Miss Angela Dunwoody, QC, counsel for the plaintiffs.
Mrs. Flynn, the normal procedure for someone seeking compensation from an employer is to approach the union. Now, did you at any time approach your husband's union?
In 1974.
I see. It's 3 years after your husband's death.
Yes, Dr. Baxter rang up the union and arranged for me to see the solicitor.
And did you in fact see him?
Yes.
And did the union bring an action for damages against Fulchester Plastics on your behalf?
No.
No. Are they planning to bring one?
No.
No. Now, why is that, Mrs. Flynn?
The solicitor. He said, without hard evidence, I just wouldn't stand a chance.
In other words, he didn't think you had a very strong case against Fulchester Plastics.
Well, no, not a watertight one, no.
Now, of course, the evidence which would have proved or disproved your case would have been the result of an autopsy, would it not? A post-mortem.
Oh, yes, yes. He did say that a post-mortem might have proved that the thing was caused by vinyl chloride.
Or,
yes.
of course, disproved it.
Yes, no.
Now, it was you who refused this post-mortem, was it not?
Yes.
Despite the fact that you say Dr. Baxter told you before your husband died that his illness might have been caused by vinyl chloride.
Yes.
Why was that, Mrs. Flynn? Well, surely you must have realized that if your husband's illness had been caused by his work, then you, as his widow, would have been entitled to compensation from the company.
I just didn't think about it. I mean, you don't think about these things at the time. He'd had such a lot of pain before he died. He'd suffered so much. Well, we'd all suffered watching.
Yeah, I can quite understand your distress, Mrs. Flynn. But with all due respect, I suggest that the reason you did not think about compensation at the time of your husband's death was that Dr. Baxter hadn't told you then that his illness could have been caused by vinyl chloride. I suggest she did not tell you that until 3 years later, in 1974, when after considerable publicity on this subject, she suggested that you bring an action for damages against Fulchester Plastics.
I just didn't want one of them post-mortems. I was glad when it was all over. I just didn't want any more messing about with him.
I call Nigel Gill.
What religion are you? Church. Take the book in your right hand and read aloud the words on the card. I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
You are Nigel Gill?
I am.
What are your medical qualifications, Dr. Gill?
I'm a doctor of medicine, a bachelor of surgery, and a member of the Royal College of Physicians. My special study is the diseases of the liver and kidney.
And you treated Mr. Flynn, did you not?
I was consulted about him.
And what was your position at the time?
I was a senior registrar at Fulchester Hospital.
Why were you consulted about him?
Well, the man was not one of my patients. He was admitted under the chest team because he had a lung cancer. But I was brought in by the consultant who was treating the case to look into the possibility of liver cancer, hemangiosarcoma.
There was some suspicion of cancer of the
Oh,
liver.
there was more than suspicion. The liver function test showed without any doubt that the liver was damaged, and there was a hard abdominal mass suggesting enlargement, possibly a tumour.
So he did have cancer of the liver,
Oh, yes.
which it is now well known can be caused by exposure to vinyl chloride.
Well, one particular type of cancer can, yes.
Did Mr. Flynn have this particular kind of cancer, Doctor?
I can't say. It's very possible that he did.
Dr. Gill, the real question, is it not, is whether the liver was the site of the primary cancer or of a secondary growth. And also, of course, the type of the cancer.
Oh, that is so.
Did you manage to ascertain any of these things?
No, we didn't. Liver cancers are notoriously difficult to diagnose. The only way to be certain of the type of tumour it was would have been to perform an autopsy.
I see. Now, did you approach Mrs. Flynn for her permission to perform this autopsy?
Yes, I did. She refused permission.
And did you explain to her that the liver disease might have been caused by vinyl chloride?
No, I didn't. I didn't know it myself at the time.
I see. In 1971, when Dr. Baxter claims she had known for 10 years. Dr. Gill, would you please explain why it is that if Mr. Flynn had this possibly primary cancer of the liver, the death certificate gives the cause of death as carcinoma of the bronchus, which is cancer of the lung?
Yes, Mr. Flynn was admitted under the medical firm. That is the team of doctors that deals with chest diseases. He did have a lung tumour, you see. And it would have been one of the doctors from the chest team who signed the death certificate. It wasn't as if anyone was looking for a cause of death, you see. The man died of cancer. And I suppose the houseman or whoever signed the death certificate just put down the most straightforward reason.
But Mr. Flynn was cremated, Dr. Gill. And in cases of cremation, the law insists upon a second certificate. In fact, I believe doctors charge a fee for signing it, for the very good reason that the body cannot be exhumed to review the cause of death later on. Now, in Mr. Flynn's case, this second certificate, the one that is supposed to rule out all argument, also states that Mr. Flynn died of carcinoma of the bronchus.
Yes, well, it's rather an academic point, isn't it? Which tumour carried the man off? Mr. Flynn died of cancer. What is in dispute is the site and type of the primary cancer.
Which you are saying was the rare cancer of the liver attributable to vinyl chloride?
I'm saying nothing of the kind. What I'm saying is there were aspects of the case at the time which puzzled me. I cannot say definitely that this was the type of cancer associated with vinyl chloride. What I'm saying is the possibility cannot be ruled out.
Despite the fact that both the cremation and the death certificate give another cause of death.
Despite that fact, yes.
Would you please tell the court, Mr. Chapman, how long you worked for Fulchester Plastics?
Yeah, I was there from 1962 to 1967.
And will you tell us what job you did?
I was an autoclave cleaner.
And an autoclave is the drum in which the PVC is made, am I right?
Yeah, that's right.
Approximately 12 feet high, 8 feet in diameter, rather like a huge cement mixer, am I right?
Yeah, you could say that, yeah.
Now, could you just describe to the jury how you cleaned one of these drums?
Yeah, well, when I was there, what we did was we washed down the autoclave first with hoses, and then they blew air through it for a bit to get the level of vinyl chloride down inside, and then you go into it and you chip away what was left on the sides and on the steering rod, because PVC sets hard when it's cool, see?
Thank you. Now, when you were put on the job of cleaning these drums, did the management tell you that vinyl chloride was dangerous?
No, the only thing they told us was that it was an explosive hazard. They didn't mention the fact that it had once been thought of for an anaesthetic, but, I mean, we all knew that if you got too big a whiff of it, it could make you dizzy.
Was there anything else you knew about vinyl chloride, Mr. Chapman, that the management hadn't told you?
Yeah, well, I knew that when I was in the autoclave, I used to get this cold, freezing feeling round my ankles and round my wrists and round my crotch.
Did you notice any other symptoms at this time, Mr. Chapman?
Oh, yeah, I had a whole load of them. I've been there 2 or 3 years. I was never really well. I was cold all the time. I ached. I got this aching feeling across my shoulders, and I felt like I lost all the strength in my arms. I was breathless, and I was beginning to find married life a bit of a problem.
In what way, Mr. Chapman?
Well, you know what I mean, don't you?
You mean you became impotent?
Yeah, that's it, impotent, that's it.
Did you consult Dr. Baxter about any of these symptoms, Mr. Chapman?
Oh, yeah, well, I was going to see her on and off all along. She must have been sick of the sight of me. But it was in, 1965, beginning of 66. I really thought there was something serious the matter with me. I mean, I thought I was a goner then.
And what did Dr. Baxter tell you?
Well, at first, she said it was bad circulation. And then when I told her about the bedside of things, she sent me to a psychiatrist. And then later on, she said that the loss of power in my arms was to do with all the hammering, because she did ask about the work like.
Yes. Has anyone ever suggested that your illness might be connected with vinyl chloride?
Yeah, Dr. Baxter did.
And when was that?
In 1967. Now, she told me about an article she'd come across in a medical magazine about some other blokes with the same condition.
What did she advise you to do?
Well, she said I should stop off work, and she said I should go and see Mr. Jones.
Did you?
Yeah, I did both.
What did Mr. Jones have to say?
Well, he said he was very sorry I was ill, he said, but it was nothing to do with him. He said there are blokes working there for 20 years with no symptoms, he said, and he said he didn't see how my illness could be anything to do with them because they kept to the accepted standards of vinyl chloride.
Did you have any further dealings with Mr. Jones?
Well, no, not with him personally. I mean, I've been off work, 3 months, and then they sent me my cards through the post.
They sacked you?
Yeah.
Yes. Did they give a reason for this?
No, they just said I've been off work too long, something like that.
So, what did you do?
Well, I went to the union, didn't I? But, I mean, they couldn't do anything about it. Well, not then. So I thought, well, sod a lot of them, and when I got a bit better, I got another job.
Mr. Chapman, when you saw the advertisement in the paper recently, claiming that levels at the Fulchester plant posed no risk to health, what was your reaction?
Oh, what a load of eyewash, I thought. What a load of bleeding eyewash.
You haven't worked at Fulchester Plastics since 1967, have you, Mr. Chapman?
No, I haven't.
Do you really think you're in a position to comment, then, about the safety procedures at Fulchester Plastics?
I'm not commenting on them.
Oh, but you are, Mr. Chapman. You just said that you thought the recent advertisement published in the Fulchester Gazette was a load of bleeding eyewash.
Yeah, but it's not a question of what the level is it? I mean, I know Fulchester Plastics, I know Jones, I know what their attitude is. They don't want anything to get in the way with their production.
So, in fact, you make your comment regardless of what the level actually is now.
Yeah.
Do you know what the level is now, Mr. Chapman?
Well, not exactly, no. I mean, I know things are better now than they were in my day.
Oh, you do know that, do you?
Yeah, well, I've heard it is.
You have heard it is?
Yeah.
Mr. Chapman, this sort of talk's all very well in a pub, but I'm afraid it's not good enough for a court of law. What was the accepted standard for levels of vinyl chloride when you did work in the factory? You don't know, do you, Mr. Chapman?
Look, it doesn't matter anyway, because they never kept to any levels in my day. Nobody ever checked.
Oh, come now. That is quite untrue. You're talking about a company that has spent £1.5 million on controlling the levels of vinyl chloride in their plant.
Ah, yeah, they have now. I said that, didn't I? I said things were better now than they were in my day.
Yes. Now, I'd like to turn now to this mysterious condition which you and Dr. Baxter have agreed between you was acro-osteolysis.
Yeah.
Have you any symptoms of this condition today?
No, it's all cleared up now.
Oh, so you've made a complete recovery.
Yeah.
Well, I'm delighted to hear that, Mr. Chapman. And I'm right in saying, am I not, that you did not sue Fulchester Plastics for damages or unfair dismissal, because I suggest you didn't have a very strong case.
Now, look, the reason I didn't have a very strong case is because I happen to have a very good doctor, right? If she hadn't told me what was the matter with me, I could have gone on working there till my bleeding fingers dropped off.
Yes, Mr. Chapman, you're here to give evidence to the truth or falsity of the allegations made by Dr. Baxter in her letter to the Fulchester Gazette. And you will do that best by answering counsel's questions in a civil manner.
Yeah, but Dr. Baxter did tell me in 1967 that I had PVC disease, and at that stage, Jones and his lot weren't bringing levels down for anyone.
Mr. Chapman.
Yeah, all right, I'm sorry, my lord.
So you did not sue Fulchester Plastics for damages?
Not yet, I haven't.
I wonder how the history of your mysterious illness would stand up in court when you do, Mr. Chapman. Mr. Jones, when you became plant manager at Fulchester Plastics in 1963, were any safety standards applied?
Yes. There were accepted levels of vinyl chloride, which were always followed.
And you continued to follow them?
Oh, yes.
Now, what were these standards in 1963, Mr. Jones?
The standards recommended by the American Conference of Government and Industrial Hygienists, which were 500 parts per million. Mm-hmm. That is, 500 parts of vinyl chloride for every million parts of air.
Well, now, of course, you operate your plant at considerably lower levels of vinyl chloride.
Oh, yes. We've always tried to keep well within the past accepted standards. In 1975, the Health and Safety Executive in this country got together with both sides of industry and produced what is known as the Code of Practice.
And what levels did this Code of Practice suggest?
10 parts per million, averaged out over an 8-hour shift.
And so your plant now conforms to this standard of 10 parts per million, does it?
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, we're now well within that range.
Does this imply, would you say, Mr. Jones, that the levels at which the plant was operated at in the past were unsafe?
Well, in the light of what we know now, yes, they were. But we didn't know that then. Nobody did.
When did you first become aware that... when did you first become aware of the danger of vinyl chloride, Mr. Jones?
Well, we learned that the American standards of the American Conference of Government and Industrial Hygienists had been reduced to 500 parts per million in 1972. I suppose that was the first warning. But it was in 1974, of course, that we first learned that vinyl chloride could cause cancer.
And what made you realize this?
Well, Goodrich in America had publicly announced that the deaths of 3 of their workers from a particular cancer of the liver had been attributable to vinyl chloride.
Now, did you take any action when you heard about this?
Oh, yes. The immediate reduction of levels of vinyl chloride at the Fulchester plant.
And had the factory inspectorate, as it was then called, been in touch with you at that stage?
No, they came in almost immediately afterwards with their recommendations.
So now would you please tell the jury, Mr. Jones, what measures have been taken at the Fulchester plant to lessen the concentrations of vinyl chloride to which your workers were exposed?
Certainly. Since January 1974, the company have improved ventilation in the plant. They've eliminated leaks in the piping by replacing all our old valves with a new and extremely reliable variety. Thirdly, we've instituted a new cleaning process in the autoclaves, whereby high-pressure water jets get the bulk of the PVC off the walls and the agitator. This means the work of the men working in the autoclaves is much easier than it was before. The PVC just falls off the walls. Fourthly, we're automating the cleaning process in the autoclaves as fast as we can.
You say the PVC falls off the walls. This isn't waste matter, then?
No, my lord, quite the reverse. It's top-quality PVC.
I see, thank you.
But the most important innovation, which we made just this year, with the union's blessing, is the institution of fixed-point monitoring.
What's that?
It's a system we organized with the shop stewards, my lord, whereby air is sampled at 32 points within the plant. These pick-up points are connected to a central monitor. If the level rises above the accepted one, which is now a maximum of 25 parts per million, an alarm sounds, and the area is evacuated.
I see. Now, these 32 points, are they just in the factory itself, or are they included in the drums that the men have to enter to clean?
The 32 points are all within the general working environment, my lord. But every man who enters an autoclave carries a probe, which he switches on when he goes in, and it then registers on the central monitor.
So that the 25 parts per million that you're talking about obtains within the drums as well as anywhere else?
That's right, my lord. And if I may just make it clear, my lord, that 25 parts per million is a maximum level. Over an 8-hour shift, the level does not exceed 10, and is usually closer to 5.
5 parts per million?
That's right, my lord.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Is everything that ought to be done to ensure workers' safety and health being done at Fulchester Plastics?
It is, my lord.
Miss Dunwoody.
My lord. Thank you very much, Mr. Jones.
Mr. Jones, you say that the first inkling you had that vinyl chloride might be dangerous came in 1972. And the American body from which you took your accepted standard reduced that standard from 500 to 200 parts per million.
That's correct.
But Dr. Baxter had first approached your company 11 years previously, Mr. Jones. It was in 1961 that she learned of the Russian study and wrote to your predecessor about it.
That was before my time. There was no record of any such letter in the company files.
But of course, the abstract of the Russian study was there to see, for anyone who wanted to see it, from 1950, the year of its publication onwards. Had you yourself knowledge of this study?
No, I hadn't, no. And I don't think I could have expected to know of it, in all reason.
Did you know of any other research, Mr. Jones? Did you, for instance, know of the research done by workers at Dow Chemicals, as a result of which levels of vinyl chloride at that company's plants were reduced to 50 parts per million at a time when the accepted standard elsewhere in the industry was still 500. Were you aware of that fact?
I wasn't aware of it, no.
Don't you think you should have been aware of it, Mr. Jones?
Now look, I'm a busy man. I can't be expected to keep up with every obscure research project. I'm a plant manager. I have a lot of other things to consider, as well as possible health hazards.
I see. So while Dow Chemicals reduced their levels of vinyl chloride to 50 parts per million in 1961, you, who were too busy to look into health matters, continued to run your plant at 10 times that level for another 11 years.
I've told you. We tried to keep our levels well within the accepted standards of the time, but I had no knowledge of the dangers. No one in this country had.
Dr. Baxter had, Mr. Jones. She approached your company in 1961.
Yes, you said that before, and I've answered you. I was not at Fulchester in 1961. I can hardly be held responsible for the plant when I wasn't even there.
All right, you were there in 1967, Mr. Jones, when Dr. Baxter told you she thought she'd come across a patient in the early stages of acroosteolysis, a disease associated with vinyl chloride.
Dr. Baxter came to me with some garbled assertions, but she still seems to me, to be a troublemaker. A woman with a bee in her bonnet, a woman with a down on profitable industry and free enterprise.
You say she came to see you with some garbled assertions, Mr. Jones. Dr. Baxter is a very cogent lady. She came to discuss with you an article in the British Medical Journal. She came to consult with you about a patient of hers who was giving her cause for concern, a patient who was an employee of yours. She came seeking your cooperation.
The last thing Dr. Baxter would seek from a man in my position is cooperation. The woman is a rabid communist. She came, as I say, with some garbled story. And the only thing that came across loud and clear was that she was threatening Fulchester Plastics with legal action.
I see. So, a reputable lady doctor, well thought of by her patients, approaches you on the subject of a patient about whom she's worried, and you leap to the conclusion that she's threatening you with a legal action. I suggest that that is the reaction of a man who's well aware that safety measures were not all they might have been.
You can suggest it if you like, but it's not true.
Now, this matter of the article which Dr. Baxter sent to you in 1967, Mr. Jones...
She did not send me an article. I had no knowledge of the article. The first time I set eyes on it was in my solicitor's office. I saw a photocopy of it when we were preparing for this case.
We are referring to the article from the British Medical Journal dated 16 September 1967.
Yes?
You hadn't seen it until this year?
No.
You mean your company had not informed you or drawn your attention to it at the time it came out?
No, they hadn't.
Ah, well then. Did you inform them of Dr. Baxter's approach to you on the subject of the article?
I keep telling you I had no knowledge of the article.
Well, in that case, Mr. Jones, either Dr. Baxter is lying or you are.
Well, I'm telling you the truth,
but
sir.
But, of course, even without seeing the article, you might have informed your company of Dr. Baxter's approach to you on the subject of Mr. Chapman. Did you do so?
No, I didn't.
Oh. May we know why not?
I didn't consider the allegation she was making had sufficient foundation.
Really? May we now turn to the subject of Mr. Flynn's death?
The cases in Fulchester Crown Court are fictitious. Join us again tomorrow when the case of Fulchester Plastics against Dr. Barbara Baxter will be concluded in the Crown Court. Barbara Baxter, a Fulchester doctor, is being sued for libel by Fulchester Plastics because of a letter she wrote to the local paper, in which she claimed that for many years the company had ignored her warnings that vinyl chloride used in the production of PVC is a danger to health. The jury in this case has been selected from members of the public whose names appear on the electoral register and who are eligible for jury service. Mr. Jeremy Lee, counsel for Dr. Baxter, is about to continue his cross-examination of Mr. Brian Jones, manager of the Fulchester plant and one of the plaintiffs.
Mr. Jones, I'd now like to ask you about the time when Dr. Baxter approached you on the subject of Mr. Flynn.
Yes?
That was in 1974.
Yes. Mrs. Flynn wrote to me at the end of that year.
Did she mention the possibility of a connection between her husband's illness and his working for Fulchester Plastics?
Yes, she said Dr. Baxter had suggested it to her.
What was your reaction to this?
I thought it was a pointless notion to have put into Mrs. Flynn's head. There wasn't a shred of evidence that vinyl chloride had anything to do with her husband's death. As far as Dr. Baxter was concerned, she was just jumping on the publicity bandwagon.
Mr. Jones, would it be correct to say that at this time, when publicity about vinyl chloride was reaching its height, that it was very important to you that Mr. Flynn's death should not be counted among those attributable to vinyl chloride?
It was neither important nor unimportant. There was no connection.
That we will never know, Mr. Jones. Now, subsequent to your exchange of letters with Mrs. Flynn, Dr. Baxter came to see you, I believe.
Yes, she did.
And on that occasion, relations between you became so acrimonious that you had her escorted off the premises.
She refused to leave.
But why did you want her to leave, Mr. Jones?
She'd been in my office quite some time. She'd no business being there in the first place. Now, look, Mrs. Flynn, I should say Mr. Flynn, had been dead 3 years. If there hadn't been all this publicity in the press, it would never have occurred to her to connect his death with vinyl chloride.
If there hadn't been all this publicity in the press, Mr. Jones, it would never have occurred to you to connect any disease with vinyl chloride.
As far as Dr. Baxter is concerned, she's just using the publicity as a stick to beat Fulchester Plastics. She doesn't care about Mrs. Flynn or anyone else. All she cares about is that we might be closed down. Yes, she said we ought to be closed down. She mentioned the possibility of Mrs. Flynn suing us.
You seem to have been very concerned with the possibility of legal action throughout, Mr. Jones. In fact, it seems to have been your only concern. Were you afraid of this matter coming to court?
Afraid? Don't talk rubbish, man. You seem to have overlooked one thing. It was I who brought this case to court. Would I have done that if I'd had anything to hide?
Now then, Mr. Jones, if we could just return for a moment to the subject of acro-osteolysis, the disease which causes bone damage. You have had some cases confirmed among your workers since 1969, I believe?
Yes, there were 4 cases that have been confirmed.
And what is happening about these 4 cases? Are you paying these men compensation?
The whole matter is under review.
Thank you, Mr. Jones. Now, just one more question. Are you aware that the American Occupational Health and Safety Association has ruled that the levels of vinyl chloride in American plants are to be reduced to 1 part per million as from January 1976?
1 part per million?
Yes.
It's not feasible.
Not feasible, Mr. Jones. Other firms are already trying to do this, aren't they?
Other firms, maybe. But as it is, we have several alarms a week. This entails stoppages in production while the area is evacuated. To set levels low would mean even more stoppages.
Ah, so what you're saying is it isn't the safety or otherwise of 10 parts per million, it's the practicability. I'm obliged to you, Mr. Jones. Thank you very much.
Mr. Jones, Mr. Flynn worked at Fulchester Plastics between 1945 and 1968, did he not?
That's correct, I think, yes.
And Mr. Chapman worked there between 1962 and 1967.
I believe so.
Now, the levels of vinyl chloride were much higher then, were they not?
Oh, yes. The accepted standard was higher, you see, because of the state of knowledge of vinyl chloride at that time.
Quite so. And even with these much higher levels, there was still no clear link between the illnesses of Mr. Flynn and Mr. Chapman and vinyl chloride.
No. And that's exactly the point. So with present levels, we can be certain we're safe. That the men at the plant are safe.
Mr. Griffiths, you're representing your company here today. Would you please tell the jury the position you hold within Fulchester Plastics?
Yes, I'm on the board of directors, and I'm also chairman of a committee set up within the company with responsibility for health and safety. It's my job to advise the company on policy decisions with regard to safety planning.
And how long have you held this position?
The committee as such has only been in existence since 1974, but my particular interest in safety goes back a long time before that.
When were you first aware that vinyl chloride was a health hazard?
Well, we've always known that it's a substance to be treated with great respect. But of course it was only in 1974 that we became aware that it was a cancer risk.
Prior to 1974, you had no knowledge of this?
No.
And in the light of the knowledge you had prior to 1974, would you say that the safety precautions then were adequate?
In the light of the knowledge that we had then, yes, I would. We advised our plant managers, including Mr. Jones, in whom I may say we have the highest confidence, to adhere to the accepted standards laid down in America for dangerous substances.
Was there any legal obligation on you to recommend these standards, Mr. Griffiths?
No. But it was felt within the company that as a responsible management, we should ensure that any dangerous substances in use in our plants should be kept at levels that were well within the accepted standard. And that, I may say, has been our policy with regard to all dangerous substances, not only vinyl chloride.
And then, of course, in the light of fresh evidence, these accepted standards were changed.
Yes, that is so. It is in their very nature that they should change.
Now, would you please explain why this is so, Mr. Griffiths?
Yes, you see, these standards are worked out on the best information available from industrial experience, from experimental human studies and animal studies, and where possible from a combination of all three. So, as fresh evidence comes to light, so the accepted standard on any particular substance may change, as has been seen with vinyl chloride. And we find that this standard is as good a guide as any to safe practice.
Now, Mr. Jones has testified to this court that the current average level of vinyl chloride in the Fulchester plant is 10 parts per million over an 8-hour shift. Are you yourself satisfied that this is a safe level of exposure?
Yes, I am. I think on the basis of all the evidence that's available, we can now be quite certain that we are operating our plant within safe limits. But we are, of course, trying to bring the level down even further, so that we can be absolutely certain.
And can you now give the jury some sort of estimate of the cost of these new safety measures to Fulchester Plastics?
Yes, indeed I can. The total cost amounts to something in the region of £1.5 million. And I may add that if these measures prove as efficacious as I believe they are, then I consider, and indeed the company considers, that it is money well spent.
Mr. Griffiths, you say that this Health and Safety Committee within your company, of which you are chairman, has only existed since 1974?
As a formal committee, yes.
Since vinyl chloride became a public issue.
And the timing is purely coincidental. We've always had people whose special concern was health and safety. It was just formalized in 1974.
Formalized? I see. Why was that, Mr. Griffiths? Some sort of public relations gimmick, was it?
It certainly wasn't a gimmick, no. It was simply a recognition of the fact that with a constantly expanding range of new chemicals in use, some slightly more formal responsibility was required for health and safety.
I see. And might one infer from that prior to 1974, your company's interest in health and safety was not all it might have been?
Now, I think that that would be the wrong inference to draw. You see, the whole plastics industry has expanded and diversified enormously over the past 25 years. Now, as something becomes bigger and more complex, so you have to formalize that structure. Now, the formation of this committee had far more to do with that than any fears that the company may have had over its past record. In fact, I think our record is very good.
You do?
Yes, indeed I do.
And yet you say you didn't know that vinyl chloride was a serious health hazard until 1974?
No, we didn't.
Mr. Griffiths, did you know of the Russian study done in 1949, to which Dr. Baxter has referred?
No, I didn't.
You agree that you could have known of it. It was, after all, summarized in English for anyone who cared to look for it.
Well, you know, I don't really think that we can be expected to comb every scientific document published anywhere in the world on the off chance that there might be some mention of one of the thousands of substances that we use.
Don't you? Mr. Griffiths, I should have thought a company the size of yours ought to have employed somebody to do just this. But even if we allow your point that this was a study not easily accessible, there were other studies of which you might justifiably have been expected to know. Did you, for instance, know of the study published by Torkelson of Dow Chemicals in 1961?
That was the one that showed liver damage in experimental animals, was it?
Liver and kidney damage, yes.
No, we didn't know about that at the time.
As a result of that study, Mr. Griffiths, Dow Chemicals reduced their levels of vinyl chloride to 50 parts per million. 13 years before your company got around to doing it. Were you aware of that?
No, I wasn't aware of it.
Don't you think you should have been aware of it, Mr. Griffiths?
No, I don't think there's any should about it. You see, there was no reason why we should have been known about this, because we were adhering to the accepted standard, laid down by the American Conference of Governmental and Industrial Hygienists.
You see, Mr. Griffiths, it's not at all clear to me what your company was doing about vinyl chloride.
I've just told you. We were adhering to the accepted standards of the time. And, of course, we often operated at levels of vinyl chloride well within those standards.
Mr. Griffiths, had you instructed your managers to notify you of any illness occurring among your workers which might have had a cause related to the working environment?
Well, I would think that any intelligent manager, such as Mr. Jones, if he came across such a thing, would automatically inform us.
You would indeed, though, of course, Mr. Jones did not inform you either of Mr. Chapman or Mr. Flynn.
I don't think that in either of these cases he had anything to inform us about.
Were you aware of the 1967 article published in the British Medical Journal to which Dr. Baxter has referred, Mr. Griffith?
Yes, I was aware of that.
Did you inform Mr. Jones of it?
I believe I did mention it on one of his visits to London, yes.
You believe?
I did mention it.
And you didn't suggest any action to lower levels of vinyl chloride in your plant?
I said that we must be sure that we always tried to keep well within the accepted standard. And of course, it was only a year or two after that that the level did come down.
Not a year or two, Mr. Griffiths, but 5 years. The article was in 1967. The standard did not come down till 1972, and it was not until 1974, when vinyl chloride became widely publicized as a substance which caused cancer, that you brought your level down to 50.
Look, I have said all along that we have kept well within the accepted standard. Now, until 1972, that was 500, and then it was lowered to 200. And then as soon as it was realized that even that level was dangerous, we did our utmost to lower it again as quickly as we possibly could.
I see. So if the accepted standard had not been brought down, presumably you would still be operating your plant at the higher concentrations.
If the accepted standard hadn't been changed, it would have meant that there was no good reason to change it.
So you admit that you depend upon the judgment of others, Mr.
In this respect, yes.
So, in fact, you and your company don't know whether the present levels of 10 parts per million are safe or not. You are depending upon the accepted standard.
I am confident that an average of 10 and a maximum of 25 parts per million does not endanger health.
Yes, but why are you so confident, Mr. Griffiths? Because it's the accepted standard?
Well, surely if the Health and Safety Executive thinks it's good enough, it should be good enough for us. However, having said that, I must emphasize that we are endeavoring to bring our levels down even lower.
Mr. Griffiths, are you aware that the American Occupation Health and Safety Association have ruled that from January of this year, all American PVC plants must reduce their levels of vinyl chloride to 1 parts per million?
Yes, we on the Safety Committee have been informed that other companies are trying to bring their level down to 1 part per million, and we're looking into it.
I see. Mr. Jones has said that it would not be feasible at Fulchester to bring levels down that low.
Well, it's certainly true to say that we are doing our best within the limits of technical feasibility. But that, you see, techniques improve all the time. And as they improve, so our standards improve.
But it's practicability rather than safety which is governing your present levels.
Well, look, you know, we really cannot do the technically impossible, you know. And if we had to make PVC, which of course is perfectly safe, and I think that most people would agree is an extremely useful substance, then we have to ensure that the limits to which our workers are exposed are as low and as safe as possible. And this we have done at Fulchester Plastics.
And at the request of the management of Fulchester Plastics, I have been conducting some experiments on rats as to the effect of vinyl chloride. We have also, I may say, conducted an extensive study at the University Department of Industrial Health of the existing literature on the subject.
And are you convinced, Professor Williams, that the present levels of vinyl chloride within the Fulchester plant are not dangerous to health?
On the knowledge we have available at the present time, I'm quite convinced that present levels offer no danger to human health.
Now, would you please explain to the court, Professor, the basis for this conclusion?
Yes, the findings of all the research conducted so far, and there's been a considerable amount of research on vinyl chloride now, indicate that the higher the levels of vinyl chloride to which animals are exposed, the greater number of tumours, including cancer of the liver.
Would you please explain to the court, Professor, the implications of these findings for Fulchester Plastics?
Yes, what it means is that Fulchester Plastics, which is operating with an average of 10 parts per million, has a 40 parts per million margin of safety before the level at which vinyl chloride causes cancer in rats.
Mm-hmm. Now, what about the other ill effects of vinyl chloride, Professor? Do the present levels eliminate those?
Well, clearly, the lower the levels, the smaller the risks. I think these levels minimize the risks.
I repeat, are you satisfied with the present safety measures in operation at Fulchester Plastics?
I am. I think the plastics industry, including Fulchester Plastics, the company with which I've had most dealings, has responded to the scientific findings in an exemplary manner. I think if other industries were to respond to health risks with the alacrity and conscientiousness that this industry has, then we would have travelled a long way in dealing with the problems of industrial health.
Finally, Professor, do you think that Fulchester Plastics were justified in making the claims that they do in their advertisement?
I do indeed. I think Fulchester Plastics can be justly proud of their record. I think it's a real achievement to have brought levels down as low as they have. And I think that these levels, as far as anyone can reasonably tell on evidence to date, are safe.
Thank you very much, Professor. You've been most helpful.
You keep using certain phrases, Professor. The knowledge we have available at the present time, evidence to date, phrases like that.
Yes.
So would it be right to say that there is still some doubt in your mind as to the claims made for present so-called safe levels of vinyl chloride?
Not at all. I'm a scientist, that's all. It would be a very foolish scientist to forget that conclusions are always contingent upon results available to date.
In other words, you are providing yourself with a let-out if the body count 20 years hence does not bear out your present conclusion.
I'm simply abiding by the rules of sound scientific practice. I shan't wait for a body count, I assure you. If my results suggest danger at lower levels, or if I read of any other studies whose results suggest that, I shall go to the management of Fulchester Plastics at once.
It is to be hoped they listen to you more sympathetically than they did to Dr. Baxter, Professor. And in the meantime, men are being exposed to levels of vinyl chloride which may or may not be safe. So you have two lots of experimental data, Professor, the rats in your laboratory and the men at Fulchester Plastics.
Oh, come, that's very sensational stuff, you know. The men working at Fulchester Plastics at present are exposed to only a fifth of the amount of vinyl chloride which is known to cause cancer occasionally, very occasionally in rats. It is my belief that that level is safe for human beings.
But cancer of the liver is not the only tumour caused by vinyl chloride, Professor, and there are also other abnormalities caused by vinyl chloride.
Yes, but it has been consistently true throughout our experiments that the higher the level of vinyl chloride to which animals are exposed, the greater number of tumours and other abnormalities. And conversely, as the level falls, so does the incidence of tumours and other diseases fall too.
Nevertheless, I put it to you, Professor, that while men are being exposed to any detectable level of vinyl chloride, there is an element of risk.
If there is an element of risk, it's a minute one.
Well, then, do you agree that a minute element of risk exists?
I suppose so. But look, the whole of life is a risk. There are 2,500 people killed on the roads of this country every year. Statistically, there is a much higher chance of a man working in this plant dying in a road accident or from cancer of the lungs or a heart attack than there is of him developing this particular cancer of the liver associated with vinyl chloride. I am as sure as I can be of anything in this life that the present levels of vinyl chloride at Fulchester Plastics are safe, and that the claims made by the management have been made in good faith.
Notwithstanding the court ruling of the American Occupation Safety and Health Association, the levels of vinyl chloride be reduced to 1 part per million as from January 1976?
Yes, notwithstanding that ruling.
Dr. Baxter's defense in this action is that the facts contained in her letter were true, and that the comments therein were fair and genuine. By genuine, I mean not inspired by some spite or other. And she has the burden of satisfying you of the validity of her defense. And Dr. Baxter doesn't dispute that Fulchester Plastics are conforming, as they have in the past, with the accepted standards of safety within the industry. You might well ask yourselves whether it is reasonable to claim, as she does, that any risk, however slight, however minute, justifies the closing of a PVC plant. And you might also ask yourself whether Dr. Baxter is being vindictive or not when she singles out Fulchester Plastics. Now, in civil cases such as this, the standard of proof is not as heavy as it is in criminal cases, so that proof need not be proof beyond all reasonable doubt, but only proof within the balance of probabilities. So Dr. Baxter has the burden of proving to you that it is more probable than not that the allegations contained in her letter are true. Will you now retire, elect a foreman, and consider your verdict?
All stand. Members of the jury, will your foreman please stand? Have at least 10 of you agreed upon your verdict?
Yes.
And what is your verdict? Do you find for the plaintiff company or for the defendant?
For the defendant.
Very well. There must be judgment for the defendant. Costs, Miss Dunwoody?
My lord, I do not think I can avoid paying costs.
No, Miss Dunwoody. However much we may disagree with the jury's verdict, the winner takes all. There will be judgment for the defendant and an order that the plaintiff pay the defendant's costs.
I'm obliged, my lord.